Hello, BookTube. Yesterday I watched a video by Tony at An Erudite Adventure where he recommended 5 books. That's all. I just picked 5 books to recommend, to put in front of you and talk about a bit. And I love the simplicity of the concept. I'm hoping that other people do too. So I want to do the same thing. I want to just recommend you 5 books. I've tried here to make them books that I have not recommended extensively before. That's a little tough to do when you're dealing with 6,000 videos, but nevertheless, I think I may have succeeded. The first one we're going to do is by Phoebe Atwood-Taylor. This is from a series of murder mysteries that she did a century ago, starring a character named A.Z. Mayo, who lived on the Cape Cod of the day. So those of you who aren't familiar, the state of Massachusetts, where I live, the greatest state in the Union, is a rectangle with a fishhook that extends out into the Atlantic Ocean. And that fishhook of land is Cape Cod. And A.Z. Mayo lives on an old Cape Cod, a Cape Cod that half the allure of these books now is how different the Cape is now than it was then. Then it was still a vacation spot for wealthy people, which is exclusive what it is now, but a lot more ordinary people live there as well. It was largely a rural farming community. And A.Z. Mayo is this kind of Socrates in bib overalls. He's kind of the essential man in the little town where he lives. Doesn't hold any elected position, but he is the essential man, if you know what I mean. If you live in a very small town, you probably have such a person, or a handful of them, where they might not hold elected office, but people want to know what they think. People who do hold elected office go to them for, how about we have some pancakes and a little coffee? No, nothing official. I'd just like to talk to you about this thing that's on my desk. That sort of thing. And he is also, because of all that, a fantastic amateur sleuth. And Phoebe Atwood-Taylor had the idea of just giving us his murder mysteries. She did it in one book, and it caught on. People loved it. Not only because A.Z. Mayo himself is a little bit different from most other murder mystery series protagonists, but also people loved it for the adventure of Cape Cod, for the exotic nature of Cape Cod. I want to recommend Death Lights a Candle. No idea if this is still in print. I don't know actually if any of these things are still in print. One of them I know is not, rather spectacularly. But this is an old Cape Cod mystery, yes, but it takes a very traditional murder mystery form, which is basically a country house murder. In a lot of traditional English murder mysteries, which I love, I could never read enough country house murders. People are gathered together, eccentrics are gathered together at a beautiful stately home in the country when they are somehow marooned there. Torrential rain, usually a crippling snowstorm that prevents anybody from going in and out and also very conveniently preserves any kind of footprints anywhere near, let's say, the window of the back pantry or anything like that. And that's what has to happen. The murder happens there and has to be solved there. There's no way for official law enforcement to get there. So some sleuth in the group has got to step forward and solve the crime. I've always found that a little bit funny. I look at these things as entertainments, so when I read a murder mystery like that, and I always want to say, once the bad guy is revealed, it's always a couple, and when the couple is revealed at the end, I always want to say to them, before you planned this, you really should have checked to see if Hercule Poirot was on the guest list. If he's in the house, you're going to get caught. Why not wait for an off weekend? But A.Z. Mayo, of course, is the one to solve this murder mystery, and it will give you a very good... These are all standalones. Every Phoebe Atwood-Taylor murder mystery is a standalone. This will really give you a feel for the series. I bet you'll like that feel. Then we'll go to a classic. This has been a classic. It was a classic of the Victorian era. It is perfect for Victober. It's nonfiction. It was in the Penguin Classic line. They're modern classics. I don't know if it ever made it into the Black Spine Penguin Classics, but nobody reads it anymore. Nobody reads this author anymore. This is Father and Son by Edmund Goss. And this is an old Penguin Classic. This is an autobiography of him growing up with his strong-willed, strong-faithed father. And it's, in a way, a precursor of all of the dysfunctional autofiction that exists today. But it's a distant precursor. It's very courteous. It's very loving in an odd way, in an odd sort of steep way. It's a weird reading experience. And people who don't know anything about the Victorian era, will often say that there are no weird experiences in the Victorian era. People who know a little bit more, just enough to be dangerous, will say that all Victorian reading experiences are weird. Neither one of those things is true, but the oddities do stand out. Victorian fiction, Victorian nonfiction, this is a standout Victorian work. I don't think I've ever recommended it on this channel before. Then we'll do Eamon Duffy, the great Eamon Duffy. He is a great historian. This is his book, Fires of Faith. And it is about England under the reign of Mary Tudor, who is infamous in history as Bloody Mary, because she very much disliked the reform of the English Church. She wanted to bring it back to its Catholic roots, to the Catholic roots of her mother, Catherine of Aragon. And it was never really all that heavily suspected that she would ever become queen. Certainly not queen regnant in her own right. I mean, she did have a husband the whole time, but he wasn't very much around. He wasn't very much underfoot. She very much ruled alone. But even that wasn't contemplated by the powers that be when she was a young girl and then a teenager. It was assumed, it was hoped, it was promulgated as law that Henry VIII would found a dynasty with a son. And it looked like he was doing that. He did have a son who lived into his teens. It just didn't work out that way. And Mary, when the crux of the moment came, where the powers that be who were favoring a rival claimant could easily have just dropped her down a well and closed the lid, she showed remarkable, I would say, Tudor courage in fighting for her own throne, which would be a terrific rallying song. That would be a wonderful feel-good moment in English history if we didn't know what she did with her reign, which was to burn people alive. To burn people alive for what they feel in their hearts, for the faiths they hold. It's horrifying. I have read a couple of recent Mary Tudor biographies that have tried to downplay it. There is no way to downplay it. There is no way, and Eamon Duffy is here putting it squarely in the spotlight. This is what it was like to live in Mary's England, if you cared about your faith. Now, it probably bears stating here, so as not to overstress what a monster she was, that a lot of functionaries were also involved in creating these policies, and also 90% of her people. I want to put this delicately. I'm not meaning offense to anyone, but 90%, I think you'll all understand what I mean, 90% of her people didn't care about their faith. They cared about an outward manifestation, what meeting house, what church do you go to, what do you say, but they were getting on with their lives. They weren't willing to suffer or die for their faith. And the reason I don't want to offend people is that I believe that's always been true in any society, about any faith. I think that's always been true. But this is a book about the people who did, and the ones who believed in the Reformed Church and knew that a regime had come into power that would not allow them to do that, and certainly would not allow them to profess it. It's tough reading. It's gruesome reading. Eamon Duffy is a very gentlemanly scholar, but even he can't get around the main point of his book. I mean, you might think on one level that the main point of his book is the nature of religious reform, what it's like to try and reform the religion of a country when the reformed religion that you're fighting against is a generation old at most. You might think that that's what the main thrust of the book would be, and it is, and it's really well done. Any of you who've read this author's other work will know how wonderful a historian he is. But at the crux of this book, the heart of this book, is an unspeakable horror that people like to not think about when they're thinking about history. They like to sort of skip mentally over what it means for someone to be burned alive. And Mary did that. Over and over again in the course of her reign, she did that. So it's fascinating. I don't think I've ever recommended it before. I don't even have a copy. Then for this next one, we'll stick with history. We'll stick with history of a kind, of a sort. This is by Simon Dunstan and Gerard Williams. Gerard Williams is actually really good at talking on this subject, or was 10 years ago. This is their book, Grey Wolf, The Escape of Adolf Hitler. This is a book in which they lay out with all the fervor in the world that Adolf Hitler did not die in the bunker at the end of World War II, that he did not take his own life, that a body double died and was burned, partially burned. The authors note that during the worst years at the end, when Berlin was partially in ruins and The Allies were approaching from the east, and the Russians were approaching from, or the Allies were approaching from the west, the Russians were approaching from the east. There was no hope. During that time, a main thoroughfare in Berlin had been transformed into a sort of ad hoc airstrip with planes that landed and took off. And these authors claim that on one of those planes at the very end was Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun, his new bride, and that they flew to a particular meeting spot, then took a submarine to South America, where Adolf Hitler lived in relative baronial splendor in the German enclaves of South America until he was an old man. Just had dinner parties, all that sort of thing. Just lived there and was well known to the people all around him, and had children, had more children. More and more children with as those years passed by. I forget what these two authors say was the final number, but they went to that German enclave and talked to a whole bunch of people. This is a weird, surreal book. It certainly is not true, but it is exactly the kind of thing that I love when two people go at a settled truth of history, and my God, they don't come much more settled than this, and attack it from all ends. The authors either pass over in silence or dismiss very quickly the things that torpedo their case. There was no back entrance to the room where Hitler killed himself. It was at the end of a hallway. And there were a bunch of people 10 feet away who watched him go in and heard the gunshot, ran to the door, and flung it open. They would all have to be lying, and their lies would all have to be consistent. There is no way that we have letters, we have personal testimonies, we have diaries and whatnot. There is no way that all of those people, many of whom survived, would have written the same way with the same conviction and the same sadness about watching a body double named Hans walk down the hallway and kill himself, and also with the Allies approaching from the west and the Russians approaching from the east and the whole city in ruins and everyone already talking about retribution and war crimes. What's the likelihood that a Hitler body double would go down that room and just meekly kill himself, and the Eva Braun body double would do the same thing? What's the likelihood that they would do that instead of making for the south, trying to head for the mountains as fast as they could? What's the likelihood? To say nothing of the fact that immediately after the war, French and German operative teams were scouring the world for escaped Nazis with a fervor that only grew over time. It reached its peak in the 50s and 60s. Now, if they were that concerned about Dr. Mengele or whatever, imagine how concerned they would be about Adolf Hitler, especially since, according to this book, no one was keeping their mouth shut. It would have been common knowledge that, Herr Grubensticker over in the next palatial estate over is actually Adolf Hitler. You can laugh at it the whole time, but it is pretty fun to read. The authors definitely remember to entertain. Okay, all right. I didn't know this little theme was going to happen. We'll do another book that tilts at an established fact of history. An established fact of literary history, to get a little bit closer to BookTube, is that William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon wrote the plays and sonnets that bear his name. That is an established fact of history, and the Shakespeare tourism industry in Stratford and elsewhere in England is worth billions of pounds a year. That's pretty established. And yet, for a long time, hundreds of years at least, maybe longer, if you listen to Evelyn Waugh's grandson, then maybe it's even longer, people have been wondering whether or not that's true. Whether or not it's actually true that a grain merchant from Stratford-on-Avon who had, as far as we know, no education, as far as we know, no travel, as far as we know, no courtly connections, as far as we know, no existence as a gentleman. He had to scrabble and work really hard to buy a kind of, you name it, family crest that his family certainly did not warrant. That for a long time, people have wondered, how could such a man, when we know all that about him, the type of person who left no books, left no manuscripts in his will, did not ever talk about being a playwright, appears to have made no money from being a playwright, hoarded grain during a shortage, was constantly being sued and suing people, a small businessman, in other words. How there has been a question for hundreds of years: how could a small businessman have written King Lear, or Hamlet, or Macbeth? How could that have happened? And that has led to the what is called the Shakespearean authorship controversy, which I love, absolutely love. I love how it riles people up. I also love that it does the same thing I'm talking about with these other kinds of controversies, which is to make you ask, how do I know what I know? I think that's invigorating for reading history, as long as we understand that this isn't heart surgery and that it's all in good fun. There's no harm one way or another. Can an author convince you? And over those centuries, the number of people who have thought that Shakespeare was not Shakespeare, that someone else wrote the plays, has been pretty big. And it has not been a bunch, there have been a bunch of cranks. But there have also been a bunch of luminaries, a bunch of intellectuals who firmly believed that. A few Supreme Court justices, Sigmund Freud, Henry James, and also, in his last published book, Mark Twain, who wrote a book called Is Shakespeare Dead? That is wonderful. This is wonderful. This is a great writer attacking the reputation, the posthumous reputation and the posthumous existence of another great writer. And it's delightfully entertaining, and it makes a lot of points. Now, the people who are in favor of course, that Shakespeare wrote his own plays, they like to dismiss points. They like to do that. They routinely dismiss the vast amount of fairly, no pun intended, erudite learning in the plays. They like to dismiss that as fairly easy to come by. I don't see it myself. That part, I don't see a lot of this, but I don't see that myself. There are a lot of erudite allusions and drop names and whatnot in the works of Shakespeare that the man Shakespeare, for all that we know about him, could not possibly have done. Not possibly have done that. Maybe a little cribbed classical mythology for his sonnets, for his long poems. Maybe if we ascribe those to them, but proponents have come up with all sorts of ways to shore that up. The magical tavern theory is one where you could go to a tavern and simply, by sitting there and drinking weak ale, you could learn all this stuff from other people. Also magical colleagues, that Shakespeare's acting troops might have known all this stuff and helped to put it in, to put lines in, whatnot. Mark Twain tears that all apart in this book. Has a great time doing it. It is a really good reading experience. And I would not be doing justice to Is Shakespeare Dead without calling your attention again to Keir Cutler, a Canadian actor and a very ardent proponent of the alternate, of a very ardent supporter of the idea that William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon, the grain merchant, did not write the plays of William Shakespeare. He crafted Twain's book, Is Shakespeare Dead, into a one-man show, and the whole thing is available on YouTube. If you just type in, Is Shakespeare Dead, you'll see him hamming for the camera. And it's wonderful, not only because it's a great way for you to, the book is a little bit hard to come by, unless it's on Project Gutenberg, but not only is that one-man show a great way for you to sort of get the gist of the arguments that Mark Twain is laying out, but also wonderfully, it proves that Twain is still funny. It proves that in the right hands, in the hands of the right reader, the right performer, Twain is still funny. So if I can remember, I'll find it and leave a link. I'm hoping it's still on YouTube. But we will wrap up, since I got this from An Erudite Adventure, and since An Erudite Adventure is firmly situated in the fantasy booktube ecosystem that I would like to join, I thought I would end with a fantasy book, a fantasy series, actually, that's quite good, and that I never hear talked about. But then again, I haven't watched the whole backload of fantasy booktubers, and let's be honest, they're the only ones who ever would talk about this. This is by Brian Ruckley, and it is Winterbirth. This is the first book in his Thanes series, Thanes. Epic fantasy that is raw and militaristic. It would be one of the common terms in fantasy uses is grimdark. This isn't grimdark because there is nobility here. There are characters to root for, but it certainly shares a lot of qualities with grimdark in terms of how relentless it is, of how real it is, how there is magic here of a kind, and there is a non-human race that could be the bad guys. They very much seem it. And we have a wonderful core cast of characters, but when I read the first book of this, it came out in a big, grainy-covered trade paperback, really nice, floppy trade paperback. When I read that, probably 30 years ago when this first came out, my overriding thought was, wow, that was fantasy for adults. This is fantasy for adults. There's nothing in here that bows the knee to all of the weird, sort of cozy antecedents to most epic fantasy. It felt real. And the other books do too. The sequels do too. I just put the first one here because if you've not heard of this, especially if you're a fan of epic fantasy, you might want to try finding a copy of this. Or if you can't, let me find you a copy of this thing. But I really, really enjoyed it. I don't think the series really lessens in strength as it goes along. So there you go. That's just 5 recommendations, 5 random recommendations. Just books that I tried to pick books that I have not mentioned all that often and put them in context and recommend them to you. And I want you all to do this. If you have a BookTube channel, I would like you to do this. It's not that hard to do. The key here is that you want to be able to talk about the books, obviously, but you also want to pick books you don't usually pick. So, for instance, if you have a BookTube channel devoted to A Song of Ice and Fire, and you've made 60 videos in 2 years, and 58 of them are about Song of Ice and Fire, and you have 4 kids, and they're called George, R, and Martin, maybe don't recommend Song of Ice and Fire in your version of this video. Instead, pick 5 things that I might not have heard of, and tell me why I might be interested in them. I hope you all do it. I'll leave a link to An Erudite Adventure down below, and to any of these that I have reviews. I reviewed Winterbirth, but it was for a journal. I reviewed it for a journal that doesn't exist anymore, so it might not be findable. But I'll certainly try to leave a link to Is Shakespeare Dead? Because that's a hoot, even if you are virulently anti-Oxfordian or whatever. If you virulently believe that Shakespeare wrote his own plays, and you don't think it's a laughing matter, first of all, untwist your knickers, because it is a laughing matter. And second, if you're not a diehard ideologue on one way or another, you're going to love the show. The show's really entertaining. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.